everyone. Good afternoon from the U.S. East Coast.
Hello from Wisconsin.
All right.
Hello.
Carl Anderson, I love the background.
Thanks. It's been my default for the past couple of weeks.
Uh-oh. Is this a self-reminder?
When I interview candidates, it helps. And I've been doing incident command for Anaconda for a while. And whenever we have an outage or an incident, this is my background.
Well, I hope it works.
It doesn't hurt.
Okay, I think we already have 11 folks, so maybe we should just get started. Welcome, everyone. As a reminder, please sign in the meeting notes. Here, I'll send a link to the specific section in the chat. And a reminder that by participating here, you're agreeing to the SLSA Foundation or SLSA or Linux Foundation Code of Conduct. First, just wanted to say hi to the new folks. I know Carl already said hi, but if you maybe want to, if you want to say anything more or just say hi, that's fine.
Sure. So I'm with Anaconda. We distribute packages for Python data science and other forms of data science. And we are working towards claiming SLSA level 2 compliance. We've got some steps to go to get there. At my last job at Microsoft, I was working with a standards group for the healthcare interoperability spec FHIR. And so I have some experience with standards, and I'm interested in SLSA, so I thought I'd, join and see what you guys are up to and see how I can contribute.
Great, welcome. Glad to have you here. Is anyone else new? I think I recognize all the other names. Okay, great. First, just want to check to see, next week is President's Day in the US. I will be out of office. Should we cancel, or is there enough people who are working that we should still stay on? Well, let me ask this. Is anyone planning to work next Monday and wants to have the meeting?
I think we should cancel. My suggestion.
I'm new, so I don't really count, but I think we have off that day too, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We technically do, although I've already accepted another meeting that day, but
okay, so it sounds like only like one or two people. It's like Arno and maybe Melba, but otherwise there'll be no one else for them to talk to. Okay, so let's just cancel then. And if anyone wants to have ad hoc meetings, obviously you can, but we'll cancel for next week. I marked it on the agenda. Can anyone, like, I don't know how to do the OpenSSF calendar. If someone could cancel that in there, that would be great.
I will send the message. Yeah, the magic incantation is you send a message to operations, but I will do that for you.
Great, thank you so much. That's perfect. Okay.
Actually, David, I have access to that because operations didn't create the new entry. I did. So I
Oh.
can, yeah. Operations was taking too long and apparently I have access. So I created it for Mark.
Oh, okay. Well,
Wow.
if you're the one on the button, then yeah, carry forth. Sorry, usually it's operations, I guess I should say.
Yes, yes.
Great, thanks a lot. Okay, so the thing, so we're already like behind schedule with the release candidate. I was talking to some other of my colleagues, and we were trying to figure out like what's really required for release candidate. And one of the things seems to be like one of the last major piece is the verification story, which was added to 1.0, and is probably like the least well defined. And I wanted to think about like, is there any way to carve it off or somehow like make it more tractable so that way we could get the release candidate out the door? One thing I don't yet have written up, but I wanted to discuss with everyone here is to kind of show like a very early draft of an idea just to get early feedback. Let me share my screen.
You muted.
Yeah. Mark, we
Right.
lost you.
I've gotten so good at that, and now I fail. Thank you. So previously, we added a requirement that was not present in 0.1 that not only do you need to build properly, but you need to generate, like set expectations for what it was supposed to be built like, and then some downstream thing has to verify that. And that still hasn't been fully fleshed out. So one possible idea would be to separate the verification piece into, it's almost like a separate level, but not really. It's almost like a qualifier. Again, this is like, I wrote this morning, so don't take this for like, this is perfect. But the thinking is like, if you don't have any automatic verification, it's just, we call it like ad hoc or something like that. I didn't use numeric levels because I think it's really actually tied to the original level. It's like how well it's enforced and probably goes along with that. Also to prevent like too much confusion between numbers. But ad hoc is basically what we have in 0.1, which is like, there's no systematic or automatic verification. It's just like attestations are available. You could check them if you want, but it's kind of on the consumer to do that. Monitored for, and I'm not tied to any of these terms. Monitored would be some sort of automatic or systematic or something like that process that detects violations or like reports it or issues warnings or something like that. But doesn't actually block. And then enforcement would be actual blocking of bad stuff from happening. And so in the levels page, it would look, maybe have something like this. And then in the table down here, there's a little bit more text. But yeah, that would be the basic idea. And then on the requirements page, ignore this. I don't know how to represent it in this table. This was just like what's currently in my working draft. The levels, I don't know. Somehow we have to split this out somehow. Basically, the package ecosystem section is more about verification and enforcement and less about, it's not really tied to these build levels. I don't think I updated the rest of that page. And so like, for example, in the build track, a change was like, I added this piece, if monitored or enforced, because before the text was a downstream system automatically verifies. And here it would be like, if monitored or enforced, and down here, if monitored or enforced, automatically down there. Anyway, any thoughts?
Let me just make a couple observations, and maybe I can kind of start the ball rolling. Because thank Mark for taking a first crack at this. So I'm trying to think of, obviously lots of people have come to this challenge. I'm thinking of the common criteria for IT which had to deal with a lot of the same kinds of challenge. What they did is they had a whole list of what they called functional, which is basically, the first part, what we already had. And then they had a whole separate list of evaluation. In other words, what are the methods I use to evaluate to determine whether or not it's accurate? And they, in fact, have a whole list of those which were separate. You could actually have, only a few functional requirements, but I evaluated a whole lot of ways separately, or maybe I have a whole lot, I don't evaluate them very much, or I evaluate them a lot. They originally had a leveling list. I think technically they still do, but a lot of people don't bother. They just do the pick and choose of the evaluation approaches that they use. And I am a little, I wouldn't call no automatic verification ad hoc. I'm actually a little skeptical about your term enforced. If you mean enforced means it's never possible to have a violation, that's kind of rough to go. If you mean it's automatic in order to prevent some violations, sure. And at least I would separate the I provide attestations from I provide attestations and someone else has reviewed it. And in many ways, I mean, is that better than an automated analysis? It depends on what kind of level you're going to. Automated analysis always has the big plus of you do it every time. Is the big minus of it usually misses lots. So, I don't know if the implied leveling makes sense. It's more of maybe just a list of these are the things that are done. I provide it. Some third party has evaluated it. I've got some automated checks, but they're not blocking. I've got automated checks, and they're enforcing.
So to clarify, there's two kind of, we need to be more clear in this in the docker, have better terminology.
Sure. Well, the challenge
there's
there's
like verification that the build system did stuff correctly. That's like the conformance program. That's separate. This would be like, so to give an example, just as like prior art, in case it's useful. At Google, we have this distinction that are what's equivalent to SLSA implementation. You could put it on like an monitoring only mode where you could go, like nothing will stop you. Like you declare your intent or expectations that like this package is supposed to be built this way.
Right.
And when you're first turning it on, you might want to turn on this monitoring mode to only notify, because like you don't want to break stuff. And then once you're confident, then you would turn it on enforcement mode. And then like it'll block you from doing stuff that violates what the policy says you're supposed to do. I mean, like any security control, like nothing is perfect, right? Like at a minimum, there could be like, if it runs on Linux, it could have like a Linux, 0 day or something like that. So I don't know how language there, I don't think we would claim like no one in the world could ever bypass it, because that's clearly not true. But it's making the same claims as build level 3 is claiming, basically, I think, is what we'd be trying to do. Yeah. Anyway, I think Mike was next.
Sorry about that. So a couple of things. One is and I think there's, I noticed a few folks had brought up some confusion on this as well of like, how does this, let's say, differ from conformance of, the actual, something like a build service and sort of that sort of thing. And one of the other things actually I wanted to bring up, because I'm not sure if folks have seen what was posted in Slack, I think over the weekend. Let me see if it's under the SLSA tooling. Yeah, I think it's under, well, I'll bring it up, but there's the Oracle has built something called Macaron, which actually does some of that verification stuff already, which is interesting and something worthwhile to maybe see what they've done there. Also, my 2 cents on the sort of enforced versus monitored versus ad hoc. I think some of it, I do wonder like how much of that is what was I gonna say? Some of that is I do wonder like if you have something like a conformance, if you have somebody come out and say, hey, I have, let's say, a YAML or whatever, it's signed by us, it's time stamped with a certain date. I can't give you access to my build system so that you can verify all this stuff. I think that's one potential solution, right? Like, because folks can just kind of say, hey, you are making a claim about a build system that I don't have access to. The next thing is, as far as the monitored, I think the way that I sort of view monitored versus enforced is it's sort of like the, scorecard or all-star kind of model of, hey, we're not saying that this sort of thing can't happen, as in like somebody couldn't have, let's say, messed with it, but are there adequate security controls in place at the build system level to sort of prevent this sort of thing? Or is it more like a detective control, right? Where we're going back and saying, hey, we are looking for these sorts of things, but we don't have a mechanism within the build system to sort of prevent it. So for example, some of this is stuff like if you look at something like, let's say, Tecton, right? If somebody has admin into the control plane, they can potentially mess with stuff. But if you use stuff like Spiffy Spire, we can detect that, we can prevent that, we can do, yada yada. Whereas in certain contexts, hey, we can't actually prevent this in an easy way. So we're just sort of keeping track of the changes, and that's the best we can do, is we could just monitor it.
So again, to clarify, an idea, I welcome ideas on how to split this. Like, verification that the build system is operating correctly is like a separate thing. That's, I think, what we called like the conformance, I think is the term that we're landing on. This would be for the consumers, like you get an attestation and you want to know, was this particular package, like, well, I think what you're describing is, was the build system compromised somehow? And this would be, was an individual package compromised, given that you trust the build system? Does that make sense? But maybe I'm also might be misunderstanding.
Well, I think there's two separate things, right? One is, I think to your point though, right, is there's two things, right? One is the build system capable of that thing, right? Is it capable of that level? And then separately, can I verify at the different levels of like which one am I hitting, right? Because there's going to be certain things that are just conformant of, let's say, hey, this is SLSA level 3 conformant build system. But remember, some of the stuff within the requirements are going to be dependent on the actual project, right? So like, even if a system is capable of level 3, if you don't configure your build correctly, it could still be purely level 1. And so I think so there's still two pieces to that, which is like, one is, hey, the build system is conformant to that piece, but then the second piece being that, like, is your build also conformant, like your actual build within sort of that build system.
Trisha?
Oh yeah, thanks. Right. Yeah, exactly. I think we're talking about two different things here, and it's important to make that distinction. And so I agree with calling out the verification separately because it is different from what the build system is doing, right? So not to belabor the point. I think again, this is just terminology. We don't have to argue too much about it, but I think maybe one good name for blocking might be fail closed. Might be more in line with standard security terminology, and monitoring the monitored mode could be called fail open, following that logic. Just an idea here.
Could you repeat that? Sorry, I couldn't hear the.
Oh, sorry, I was mute. Oh goodness.
No.
No,
You
no,
said-
we heard you.
I
we
think
heard
the term is blank, but then like there was noise here and I couldn't hear the
Yeah,
one word.
okay.
And then you
I heard fail closed. That is standard terminology, but I should warn you that different communities interpret that exactly the opposite way. So I would suggest not using that. The problem is that the word closed has two meanings. Do you mean a closed circuit? Everything always goes through, or do you mean a closed door? Nothing goes through. Everyone loves that term fail closed, but not everyone agrees on what it means.
Yeah, it's like
So let's not use that phrase.
it's like positive and negative, right? Which
Right.
right.
Right. So I was just, fail by, I'm sure we can wordsmith this, but some expression of it'll fail, the build will fail if the checks fail.
Right. Another proposal then is maybe verified instead of enforced, if that, you're verifying signatures, not necessarily a policy yet. So I think Gilbert's turn is next.
Yeah, hey guys. So again, a couple of ideas. What I've used in the past is governance. And governance is a big word when it comes to supply chain. But governance in a sense of, hey, do we even have any kind of governance? Or do we have any type of what I call in two areas, strictness and maturity? And the strictness is more like, hey, I'm just advising, I'm kind of giving some guidance. Then you start creating those standards. Then you start reporting on the standards. And then you start auditing and then governing soft and governing hard. That's kind of how I call it, or that's kind of how I put it. And then on the maturity side, it's, well, how mature are you with these controls? Or I don't know what the right terminology is, but that's kind of how we built this in the past, where we didn't really have anything in the past, but now we started kind of, the first level is like, hey guys, we want to put some strictness on this. We want to start advising teams, hey team, you really ought to think about, doing these tests, or you really ought to think about, looking at these tools to help with these things, right? And then standards would be, hey, now that we've had these, kind of recommendations, we're really going to start kind of writing out what that standard looks like. And then we're going to start reporting and letting you know, by the way, this is deviating from that standard. And then we're going to start doing the trust and verify approach. I don't know if that helps, but I'll pause there. And then you have the soft and the hard governance, which is soft is like you're slightly applying those soft rules, and then the hard rules where you like definitely apply the rules.
Yeah, so maybe to reiterate what what I think we're trying to get at with it. Well, what I'm trying to get at with this particular concept is the requirement that somehow something knows what a package is supposed to be built from, like the source repo, for example. And then something like actually checks it. It actually checks the provenance, and that the provenance matches the expectations. So Visa had talked about this and we talked about this various times in previous meetings. Like if you have a builder that is level 3, that whatever powers that be decide that we accept this as being level 3, awesome builder, let's say, and you're trying to build some package, let's say PyYAML, which is a Python package. The real PyYAML source code is GitHub. The canonical source code is github.com/YAML/PyYAML. If someone uses this level 3 builder but builds from a fork, that should be stopped somehow. That concept didn't exist in 0.1, and I want to add it to 1.0. And like with the current wording in the draft, it says, well, it doesn't exactly say, it's intending to say that that's a required thing, but the downside to bundling it into the build levels is, one, if you want to just if you just have an artifact and just say, tell me what the provenance is, I don't have any expectations, I just want to know like where this thing actually came from, then like you're not doing that new thing of checking like what the canonical source repo is. And so you can't call it build level 3, which is kind of like some bundling, which seems unnecessary. But also like, it's a bit kind of confusing about like what exactly the build guarantees are. And it also makes it harder to get out the door. So that's kind of basically what I'm trying to split out, is like that piece of like, what is the expected upstream repo, or whatever the build parameters in general, like how the thing was built. And like what we call that, basically, yeah. And I would expect that to be like part of like the packaging ecosystem, to kind of do it systematically, yeah. So I don't know whose hand was first. I think everyone raised their hand at the same time.
I think Arno's next.
All right, thanks, guys. I mean, so I think I know what you're trying to get to, but at the end of the day, this is a specification, and the whole point is to define a set of requirements that different actors in the ecosystem are going to claim conformance to. And so I think, adding another kind of way, I mean, there are many ways you can splice this problem, but at the end of the day, it's only useful to the extent that you can articulate it over these different roles that we currently have in the spec. And I'm a bit afraid that taking a different direction from the one we currently have is going to be more confusing than not, because at the end of the day, what is going to matter to people is, okay, I'm a builder, I'm a build service or platform provider. What do I need to do to comply with to be conformant? I'm a user. What do I need to do? And so on. I'm an ecosystem, what do you call that? Package provider. What do I have to do? And I think it needs to be articulated over these kind of roles that we have identified. And maybe we need more if we don't have them all, or maybe we need subcategories in the case of consumer, because I think that's where it touches. The verification part is more on the consumer side. And it seems like we have different types of consumers. And so it might be worth, diving a little bit deeper into that aspect. But I don't know that it's useful to create a different dimension that's kind of orthogonal to all of that. It just makes you turning into a matrix. What does it take to be conformant now? I'm not sure.
Michael, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So to take a step back to just the oh geez, I might have just lost it.
Do you want me?
You know,
I can jump ahead and give you a second.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. So I think one of the challenges here is, what's the threat model? What are we trying to counter? If what we're worried about is, unintentional, accidental mistakes, I built the wrong thing, that's one thing. If we're trying to counter malicious, someone who's maliciously trying to insert I built the wrong thing, that's a whole different level, and maybe that's part of the confusion here. I mean, I'll give you a for instance. If you are concerned that the parts of the build environment are being controlled by an adversary, the trying to do the fix within the build environment seems like just another form of insanity. What you want is separate. We immediately come back to the reproducible builds question. And for a lot of registries, they like, as far as I know, for example, I don't know about Anaconda. I'd be curious to know, but I'm pretty sure. But at least last I checked for PIP, you upload the built wheels and other built things. It's not built on a separate build system. That's not how they do things. So I'd love to see them rebuild and do a reproducible build check. But if you're going to build, you're still depending on an assertion from someone else, which may be okay if you trust that individual, and it's not okay if you don't. And so in that case, what you're really doing is checking, who makes these assertions, and then I can make a determine whether or not I trust that that individual's assertions. So basically, a quick summary is, what's the threat model? I think that's where we're getting a little wrapped around the axle.
Yeah. So now I remember it. It's a little related to that, which is the way I was sort of viewing, and I think we had this conversation prior, which is like, for me, I do think that if I have some code that I'm building, and it's like, let's say Debian, right? And I'm building the Debian package for this Python package. For me, I think the SLSA stuff that I'm looking at is, I don't care necessarily that I'm building this Python package. I care that the source code for the thing I am building came from this, let's say, Debian repo. And that Debian repo might call the upstream Python thing, but that's less relevant to me than that initial piece of saying like, hey, I'm pulling down this code that refers to the Debian or this fork of whatever, I care that it's like that. And then I'm calling this build this build manifest, this build script, whatever, that build config. Because then I can go back as when I do a verification, and assuming that the code is open, I can go back and just sort of run that, right? And it pulls, let's say, that thing down, and I can go and have other mechanisms to monitor what's happening there to find out that, yes, it actually goes out, pulls down code from this repo. And if it turns out the network or whatever is different, and it actually, you think you're pulling from X, but Debian's build servers pull from Y, oh, there's a discrepancy there. I can't verify that. That's still something I care about. I don't care so much about, like, and Mark, correct me if I'm wrong here, like, when you mean canonical repo, you're talking about like, what is that actual upstream thing I'm building? What is the project I'm building?
Yeah, like, what is it supposed to be built from? So for Debian, this would not, and like building the PyYAML package, it would not be the GitHub repo, but rather Debian's mirror, because like that's where it's supposed to be built from, like, because it has the Debian patches, etc. And that's kind of the definition of canonical for, because like Debian, because it's not the PyPI package, it's the Debian package. Those are two different packages. In terms of threat model, like the specific thing that I think is not addressed in 0.1 that I want to be addressed in 1.0 is the case where a maintainer, or more likely their account credentials, become compromised, and someone from package foo uploads a version of the package to the registry that does not come, that contains like code or behavior that the team or organization or whatever that owns the code did not authorize. So for example, in like a private company, let's say you have a requirement that all code has to be peer reviewed. If the system overall, the packaging system, should prevent the case that someone can get unreviewed code kind of like out to the package publication or to consumers. That's the threat model. Does that answer your question, David? Does that help?
No, because who am I worried about unintentional mistakes by that packager? Am I worried about an external adversary? Am I worrying about the build organization, somebody within the organization intentionally subverting something?
I think the level describes the point of the level was to do that. Like level 1 is targeting just mistakes, but it could be easily bypassed. Level 2 is targeting people who are like maybe curious or low skill or low risk tolerance, because there's some sort of control in place, but like the threat of detection or of getting fired or something is sufficient to deter them. And then 3 would be like a relatively advanced adversary who, like you really have to find, we don't really have a strong, like a solid definition there, but kind of like most adversaries that you care about would be stopped. And in terms of like who, I think like what.
Yeah, see, I'm not entirely sure. By the way, for example, one of the challenges that people have is accounts getting popped, and they rebuild a package and post it up. They don't have access to the GitHub account. They only have access to IPI or whatever. Is that a sophisticated attack? Not often. Often it's just bad passwords get easily guessed, or reused passwords, and it's on a list now.
Right. So the idea here would be that we shouldn't have to, as an additional layer of defense. Like I'm not saying like get rid of passwords and allow anyone to post, or like account credentials, but rather as an additional layer of defense. Like we shouldn't have to put. Right now we have to put all our trust in every account who has write access to the package. Right.
Right.
Any one of those account credentials can be used to do upload a package, and it's almost impossible to detect when that's bad, because like if it's a binary thing, you have to like disassemble it, and even if it's source code, like no one's actually inspecting the source matches, looking for bad things. Occasionally people do detect those things, but not often. We want to just like systematically eliminate that, and by doing that we could trace it back to the source code. That's not perfect because like the source code you could like submit to the source code, but we're at least eliminating one class of threats.
Right. I get that. It's just I'm not sure that we're reaching. It's not clear to me that we're reaching that, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, and I want to see like how can we reach it. Arno's had his hand up for a while, so I want to.
Sorry.
No, but no worries, because I mean I want to bring up another point, so I was fine with you going deeper on that first. And what I'll say maybe a bit crazy, bear with me, because I think it's a departure from the way SLSA has been built to date. But I have to say, so what I'm seeing is right now we have definition of different levels at a fairly high level, and then we try to, define what it means for different types of implementers, with tying actually what those different levels are between the different categories of implementers. You could take a different approach where you untie those things all together. You just define for each type of implementer, independently of the others, what each level means. Because you were resisting, you add this verification, which makes sense from a functional point of view. And you say, I don't want to call it different levels. And I'm like, well, why not? And the reason I believe is because levels are mean something else and are tied to other things. And if you start defining levels there, it's hard to see how this reconcile with the levels defined for, like the producer, the build system, and so on. But, just for the sake of it, I have to ask, would it make sense to kind of, divorce those two things? They're two different dimensions. Do you
So,
start
like,
with the levels and define the different implementers, or do you do the opposite? You start with the different implementers and define what the levels are for each category.
So you're saying instead of here of like having one build track and then there's like this orthogonal dimension of like how verified or whatever is that level, there'd just be two tracks. There's the build track that describes where the responsibilities are on the producer, meaning like the package owner and also the build system. And then a second level, actually, let me go to the requirements page. Like this part would be the build level, and then this stuff would be, the package ecosystem. It's almost like a package level.
Essentially, yes. And that's what I'm getting at. And maybe there are different levels in that category. Maybe it's just not one, there are a few, but they don't have to be tied to the build levels. I think that's where you're struggling with this. Like, you're trying to insert the different types of variations, and you don't want it to be tied to those build levels. So maybe the solution is to untie them.
Yeah, I wonder.
And the fact is today, just we have all the boxes checked there anyway, so it's not very useful. Oh, you don't have it in your version.
Yeah, and this is the one that's from my local client. I
Oh,
added
yeah,
this
because
column.
you have the E. Okay, all right.
Yeah,
So that makes sense. That's pretty much
again,
what
this
I'm.
is a draft.
Yes, I've not seen this, but okay, so that's very much in line with what I'm talking about. So it's not completely crazy, I guess.
Yeah. So then I guess the question is like, but basically for 1.0, my main concern is like, I want to figure out how this all comes together. I feel like once we know that it all comes together, we don't have to define those other tracks right away. Like just like the source one, we say, okay, we know it's going to be there. We could just draw a black box around it. That's fine. Once we know how it comes together, I feel like it's okay to like not have all those details yet. And so we could just release 1.0. My concern about having the, let's say package level, for lack of a better word, be separate is like, how does that interact? Like if we have a source level, like let's say the source level defines like code review or something, which is independent of the build level. Do you, like, what does level 3 of the package thing, like, what are you enforcing?
So
Like,
I don't know what they are, but what I'm saying is the package level and maybe the source. I was going to say that too. I was going to say, we talked about source levels. There's no reason that source level 1 would match build level 1, right? You could have different types of association between the different categories and the levels.
Yeah. I mean, for example, it's not at all unusual to use GitHub with certain settings on your for source code control, but you use a completely different system for building.
So you could imagine down the line being SLSA source level 1 and build level 2, just making it up, and package level 3 or something like, level 1 or, it's this idea that you want to untie those things. You define different categories. We have source, build, and I guess now package or something along those lines. And for each of those categories, you define different level independent of the others. I think then you can introduce your verification step or section with those different levels, defining them as different levels, 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah, I guess one area where it kind of comes together a little bit, and maybe this is just like an interface between two components, and that's okay to have interfaces. In the provenance generation piece, I think, like, do we have something? No, we don't. I think when the build system generates provenance, I think it has to do it in a way that it is possible to know what an expected value is. So, for example, if you, and this is something we've run into that I'm trying to kind of fix with 1.0, I'd like to fix 1.0. If the provenance is like, here's the list of every Unix command that I ran, technically it's correct, but it's like too low level and there's no way to know whether that's legit or not, because like, I don't know how the package is supposed to be built. And if someone inserted something malicious of like, they did all the normal steps, but they also ran some extra commands, I'd never be able to detect that. And so I think like a good design of the build system would be to have a like minimal, external parameters using the, where is this? Also right there. Like using like this picture, like minimal external parameters. So that way it's like feasible for someone to actually know what's legit and not. So like with our GitHub Actions example, we have it here. Oops. Oh, how are we going to fix that? Yeah, that's to do here, by the way. Like the parameters are like the inputs, which are like variables and vars, but it's basically just this. And so someone could know like, oh, the repo's wrong, or the branch is okay, or I don't care about the branch or something. But it's not like too low level. And so that's basically what I'm struggling with. I don't know if any of that made sense. Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I think that does make sense, and I think the way that I'm, and I think I agree with Arno on a lot of what he brought up, which is just like, I think that there is, right, like the way that I'm sort of once again envisioning it is one of the reasons why we have those different build levels is, let's say something is level 3, it is practically harder to lie about what happened, right? Unless obviously, if assuming that it actually is hitting level 3, right? Build level 3, right? If it's hitting build level 3, some of the things are practically harder to lie about, especially like that doesn't stop the actual build service itself from lying, but we're assuming that a conformance program and some of those other things are sort of saying like, hey, we checked this or we self-attested and under risk of legal liability or whatever, we're largely as in, the folks who are running the build system are telling the truth. Which is separate from, hey, a malicious actor coming in and trying to compromise that build system versus a malicious actor running the build system. And then I think the other thing is just, the other thing that I'm seeing just, and this is just based on what we've been talking about as like the other big piece is, so if that piece is more about what is the responsibility, like, what can I verify within a build system? What is the expectations of the conformance program for the build system so that I know like, hey, if they claim this level of social conformance and they claim this level of the, then when I see a salsa at a station. What should I be able to expect? What should I be able to potentially verify? And then separately, I think that there is I think that there's something. Actually, yeah, never mind. I think that's the big thing from my perspective.
Okay, thanks. This was really helpful. Again, I want to be able to have a release candidate as ideally like this week. And I'm trying to figure out how we could carve out verification. Adding it as another track, I think, is a good idea, so long as we have confidence that it'll actually work and come together. So I will try to put together some sort of draft based on the conversation here, just to see what it looks like, and then we could figure out well, maybe for the release candidate, we'd like just hide that part,
Yeah.
and just go with what's solid, and then in 1.1 we could write out the details.
Yeah, I mean,
Brandon,
that may be the simplest way to go. By the way, I mean, the other parts have had a lot of work. This is last minute rush.
Yeah, exactly. I'm getting worried about that.
Yeah.
Brandon, you had a thing about the SPDX build profile. Is 10 minutes, 9 minutes sufficient for that?
Yeah, I think this was mainly talking to Michael last week. He mentioned that there was a bit of chatter on questions on what SPDX is doing. So mainly, I think my kind of agenda here is just to answer any questions if there is anything about that. I think I can give a very quick 3-minute to 5-minute update on what's happening with that, and then I think we can just have it open for questions. So just to quickly share, so the build SPDX3 build profile has kind of been looking at how do we represent builds and information about builds in SPDX. A lot of the impetus of this comes from the safety use cases where they have to provide basically step-by-step information on how they build a certain thing and the configurations that go into it. But obviously, I think there are a lot of other use cases as well. So we have documented a list of use cases that the SPDX build profile, tree build profile is encompassing. We have a draft, and SPDX 3.0 model is kind of moving towards the draft stage right now. So this is I think what we talked about was how does it work with salsa, and the idea is that SPDX would reference salsa. I don't think we are kind of in the business to necessarily dictate what the artifacts produced by the builders should be in terms of metadata. But we want to be able to represent whatever salsa is being produced, whatever reproducible built infos are being produced, and be able to express it in SPDX. So kind of like a representation for compliance and policy for those that want to use SPDX. So yeah, I think we have a bunch of relationships and a bunch of SPDX things that are not only used by build profile, but also the safety profile and use cases as well. Melba.
Hey, Brandon. 2 quick questions. One, do you have a sample draft of what the build profile would look like in its final form? And then the second question I have is, you mentioned referencing salsa within SPDX, but how about enabling salsa to reference an SPDX document to help with attestation, right? Because someone might need to provide an SPDX artifact, whatever it might be a build profile, might be an SBOM, and then verify whether or not it is SLSA compliant. So are you helping, or are you willing to help the SLSA community enable us to link to an SPDX in their specification, right? So that way we can help anybody that is using use it as an additional artifact. I don't know if that helped or not.
No, I think you bring up a valid point. I can't say that we've kind of that topic has been discussed at length yet. So we'll be happy to chat a little bit more as to maybe you can share a little bit about at least what's in your mind when you're thinking about in terms of that, and then we can see whether how we can go about doing that. But no, I think this is a topic that we haven't touched on yet, but I think it makes sense to chat about. And to your earlier point, we have, let me share. This is a slide that Kate and I had during the Open Source Summit Japan for build profiles. And so we actually have some examples of, maybe let me just share my screen really quickly here. And then I'll get to you, Michael, one sec. So I shared this inside. Wait, did I share it? No, yeah, I did. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I did this with, I believe, PyPI, a package, and then kind of just like mock that up. Obviously, this is all just like done by hand. This is what the model's going to look like with it. We also did it with Yocto. Yocto being kind of like already a big user of SPDX. So kind of just mocking up what it looks like in terms of that. And being able to show like, oh, what would it look like if, for safety use cases that they want to drill down to the like, command specific arguments, that's kind of extending a little bit further than I think the supply chain security case. And this is more for compliance. But yeah, these slides should contain some examples, and I'll be happy to kind of, if any questions, just feel free to ping me on that. Michael?
Yeah, so one quick, I think one of the primary use cases that a few folks have brought up is they would love to be able to have a way both in SLSA, or a way in SLSA, and once again, this is less about SPDX as opposed to just sort of making sure that we can collaborate, is to say, I would love to have, to just sort of say, here's my SBOM, and that should count as my materials. Right, so as a not as the materials, but as a reference for what the materials are. So as opposed to having two separate, ways of recording it. And in certain cases, remember, like for folks, is in certain cases you could be as granular or as non-granular as you want in the SLSA, in a SLSA document about what the materials are. Right, you could just sort of say, hey, here's a hash of, the tarball, that's all the source and its dependencies. And I'm not gonna, it's not SLSA's, it's not in SLSA's wheelhouse to actually break that out into individual things and what they are. But it might also be able to say, if let's say you are generating an SBOM, it would be nice to just be able to say, oh, actually, here's an SBOM. The SBOM says what the source is, all the dependencies. That's a reference to that.
Right, so kind of like having almost like a tagged on link or metadata on here's a hash and here's a document that describes information about this hash. Right.
Pretty much. So yeah, it's almost like something like, as opposed to an actual thing, similar to what you had mentioned with the build profile, potentially saying, hey, I don't have an actual build profile. I have, here's a reference to a SLSA document, which essentially describes the build. It would be useful to have something almost like the other way around.
So you're talking about having a reference from like within the SLSA predicate.
Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah. And I know that's something we've discussed. And the idea here is like, it's not really anything on the SLSA side that would be required outside of just making sure that generally those things are, would be, compatible.
Yeah.
And then also, I'm sure from a tooling perspective, when we get to the tooling meeting, we'll have to make sure that if there are loops where the document refers to the build profile, as we will need to make sure that that gets dealt with. But that's a different problem.
Okay, so it looks like we're at time. Thank you, everyone. And we will not see you next week, but we'll see you in 2 weeks. I think there's also the community meeting. Is that this week? So I'll see folks at some other point or via chat. Bye, everyone.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Mark, who did you want to stick around? Okay. All right, I'm gonna. Mark, I didn't hear anything, so I intend to push the in meeting for all button.